All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping into a space that's honestly as fascinating as it is deeply unsettling. We're going to explore the deep psychological architecture of Alexandre Momonuki's trilogy, The Passage of the In-Between. So prepare yourself, because this isn't just your standard literary analysis. It's basically an autopsy of memory, trauma, and the human mind. So who sits in judgment when the courtroom is literally inside your own mind? It's a dark, heavy question, isn't it? Throughout this explainer, we're going to step into the internal tribunal of the trilogy's protagonist, Daniel. This is a mental space where every single memory gets dragged to the stand as evidence, where every childhood interaction is heavily scrutinized, and where a lifelong trial just keeps going, with absolutely no end in sight.
Just listen to this quote. For a long time, I believed I was being judged. Only much later did I realize the courtroom had always been mine. Man, just let the weight of that sink in for a second. The absolute most terrifying realization Daniel has isn't that the outside world is harsh, but that the jury, the judge, and the executioner, they're all constructed inside his own head. He built the very tribunal that condemns him.
Okay, let's dive into this. At the absolute center of Daniel's life is this relentless antagonistic force known as the intimate. Now, this isn't a villain in the traditional sense. The intimate is the unwavering eyewitness inside his mind. It acts as an internal prosecutor and a silent observer that just relentlessly interrogates Daniel's lifelong memories. It's that nagging voice that forces him to confront his past, questioning literally every move, every failure, and every silence.
Chapter 1. Framing the Estrangement.
So to understand exactly how this internal courtroom was built, we've got to look at the foundation where Daniel's lifelong sense of inadequacy really began to take root. The eerie cover art of Induced Estrangement perfectly captures that feeling of being an outsider in your own life. Notice the ghostly, faded face etched onto that cold, dark brick wall, right next to a discarded poison bottle? It's a brilliant visual for Daniel's existence, feeling like a fraud who's learned to just function instead of actually feeling, kind of slowly fading into the background of a world he doesn't quite get. And we can actually map this psychological erosion. It happens in very distinct phases. In phase I, Daniel feels like a complete fraud, just occupying space purely out of habit rather than actually belonging. Then, by phase II, as he resists this forced conformity, he gets labeled untreatable. Moving into phase III, he's deemed unwanted, actively erasing himself from situations. And then finally, phase IV, the sheer exhaustion of disappearing entirely and realizing that no one even missed you. His identity is meticulously dismantled, phase by phase. Then, after years of this crushing weight, a name is finally given to his experience. The diagnosis is revealed: autism spectrum disorder, level 1. Take a moment to just let that clarity sink in. For decades, his inability to instinctively grasp unwritten social rules, his sensory overloads, and this profound feeling of being a fraud, they were all viewed by him and his internal tribunal as massive personal failures.
So, the crucial point is that his autism wasn't a character flaw. As the text brilliantly puts it, nothing in him truly changed. What changed was the frame. This diagnosis finally offered a framework that made his lifelong estrangement actually make logical sense. The person himself didn't change at all, but the lens through which his entire life was judged, that finally did.
Chapter 2. The Dark Room Memory.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that a diagnosis doesn't just erase the past. Delving into the historical evidence of Daniel's trauma, the haunting imagery on the cover of the second volume tells a truly terrifying story. See the skeleton lying in a crib, the old typewriter, and that massive, imposing shadow of a hand reaching out to silence it all? This visually ties directly to what the text calls the 1978 dark room memory, which is basically the foundational piece of evidence in Daniel's internal trial.
Was that really necessary? When Daniel's internal prosecutor, the intimate, drags this memory to the stand, it asks this with a cold, interrogating tone. A baby, left completely alone in the dark, crying until it just stops. Was leaving him in total isolation really necessary? The cross-examination here is absolutely brutal. And the tribunal presses even further. What exactly was supposed to stop? Was the goal merely to stop a baby's crying, or was it to extinguish something much deeper inside him? To break a spirit before it even had the chance to fully form? Let's look at the actual facts of the 1978 record. A baby crying in an isolated crib.
a dark room enforcing total silence, a shadow interrupting the space, an outstretched hand meant to silence, and finally, the devastating silence that follows a broken spirit. As the author points out, early indifference acts exactly like a loaded gun left on a table. The trigger doesn't even need to be pulled, right? The mere threat and the isolation are enough to kill a part of you. Chapter 3. The Body as Memory. This brings us to the third volume of the trilogy, MammaMine, where we move from the memories stored in the mind to the physical evidence of trauma stored within Daniel's very body. The central premise here is that the body stores what the mind tries to forget. The mind is a master of fragmentation, right? It can block out pain, it can alter narratives, or just completely shut down. But the physical body, it keeps a perfect, visceral, undeniable record of every single transgression. Just look at the sensory evidence presented to the tribunal, a dirty margarine lid rubbed on his face as a toddler, the sweet, nauseating smell of cinnamon that his body instantly registers as a threat, kind of like an insect reacting to poison. The physical act of silent crying, chest heaving without making a single sound so as not to disturb the volatile peace of the house, and the masado, the flat, worn-out pillow he anchored against his stomach to sleep every single night since childhood, just to remind his body where its boundaries end. This abstract trauma is intensely, physically real. And this brilliantly illustrates how Daniel's trauma became completely invisible. If you compare Daniel to his sister, Lourdes, the contrast is stark. Daniel was seen as the strong. He was invisible, quiet, and because he internalized everything, no one thought he needed repair. Lourdes, on the other hand, was seen as the broken. She manufactured crises, demanded attention, and everyone rushed to fix her. Basically, one child learned to survive by disappearing, while the other learned to survive by causing chaos. Now, this dynamic didn't just happen by accident. It was the direct result of triangulation. This is a highly toxic family dynamic where the mother created small, conflicting narratives between her children. She complained to Daniel about Lourdes, and then turned around and complained to Lourdes about Daniel. It kept a constant underlying war alive in the household. And while everyone was busy fighting each other, no one ever stopped to ask what the mother was actually doing or what was truly happening to them. Chapter 4. A Trial Without Verdict. So, what actually happens when you finally see all the evidence and the internal courtroom runs out of witnesses? There was no case. There had never been a tribunal. There had only been a life being examined as though it were a crime. Man, this is the incredibly powerful, empathetic realization that completely shatters Daniel's worldview. The lifelong internal trial, driven by the intimate, was essentially an illusion. It was an architecture built entirely on inherited trauma and this desperate need to find a reason for his pain. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a person trying to survive a completely broken system. Let's move to and see how this builds to a rather haunting question. What remains within us when the stories of the outside world come to an end? When the tribunal packs up its papers, when the abusive narratives of the past finally fade away, who is left in the silence? It's a profound, quiet realization that leaves you sitting right alongside Daniel in the aftermath of an imaginary war. If you want to step into this courtroom yourself and experience the astonishing psychological depth of Alexander Momanuke's work, you absolutely need to read this trilogy. You can witness the full trial by exploring the Amazon editions at linktree.ee/Alexander Momanuke. Until then, take a moment today to listen to your own internal tribunal and maybe ask yourself whose voice is really speaking.